All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into something I think we can all relate to. Water filters. I mean, who doesn't use one these days, right?
Yeah, pretty common sight in most kitchens.
But have you ever stopped to think about what they're actually doing? Like what's getting filtered out and what's not?
It's one of those things you kind of take for granted until you start digging a little deeper.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to unpack this recent article from BBC Science Focus magazine. It really gets into the nitty-gritty of water filtration, what works, what doesn't, and what you really need to know.
It's fascinating stuff. Really highlights how important understanding this technology is, especially these days.
Totally. And I think you might be surprised by some of the things we learned, like what filters actually do a good job of removing and what they totally miss.
There are definitely some misconceptions out there.
For sure. So let's start with the good news. The article points out that your everyday pitcher filter, the kind you probably have sitting on your counter right now, is surprisingly effective at removing chlorine.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the big ones.
You know, that kind of chemical taste you sometimes get from tap water?
Right.
Yeah, filters can pretty much get rid of that completely.
Chlorine's a funny one, isn't it? On the one hand, it's essential for public health. Kills off all those nasty bacteria and viruses that could be lurking in the water supply.
Yep, can't argue with that.
But on the other hand, it definitely affects the taste. So filters use activated carbon, which is super porous, and grabs onto those chlorine molecules, making the water taste much cleaner and fresher.
Makes sense. And it's not just chlorine they're tackling. The article also mentioned pesticides and even, get this, pharmaceutical residues. Like leftover bits of medication. Kind of freaked me out when I read that.
It's a little unsettling when you think about it, but it's a reality. You know, all those medications we take, they don't just disappear. They end up in the wastewater system, and traces can make their way back into the water supply.
Right, it's all connected.
It is, and even tiny amounts of those substances, over time, they can potentially impact our health and the environment. So filtering them out is a definite plus.
Totally. And the good news continues because filters can also tackle lead and copper.
Ah, yes, the heavy hitters, especially from older pipes. They can leach into the water.
Big concern, especially for families with young kids, right? Because lead exposure can be really harmful to their development.
Absolutely. So filtering those out is a major win.
Oh, and the article mentioned hard water, too. Some filters can soften it by reducing calcium and magnesium. I never realized they could target such specific things.
Yeah, filtration technology is pretty sophisticated. Different filters use different methods like ion exchange or reverse osmosis to trap certain substances while letting others through. It's really interesting.
Science.
Right. But, and this is where things get a little tricky, there are limits to what filters can do.
Yeah, there's a but coming. I can feel it.
Haha. Well, the article pointed out that a lot of common filters, they miss things like nitrates. In fact, they even mentioned a study that found unsafe levels of nitrates in a good chunk of water samples.
Nitrates. I don't think I've ever even thought of the nitrates in my water.
Well, they're a byproduct of agricultural runoff, fertilizers and such. They can be especially harmful for infants, interfere with the blood's ability to carry oxygen.
Oh, wow, that's serious.
It is. So if nitrates are a concern, you might need a filter specifically designed to remove them. Or look into a more advanced system.
Okay, so that's one to watch out for. And then there's this whole other thing that caught my attention. Smaller molecules, like hormones, bacteria, and viruses. Apparently filters often struggle with those.
Yeah, that's right. They kind of slip through the cracks because they're just too tiny to get trapped by those conventional filters.
So it's like a size thing.
Pretty much. Those filters are great at grabbing the bigger particles and some chemical compounds, but when it comes to those microscopic biological threats, they might not be enough.
So what can you do if you're worried about those tiny guys?
Well, there are filters that use ultrafiltration or reverse osmosis. They can get those smaller contaminants out, but they tend to be pricier.
Oh, of course.
And the good old-fashioned method of boiling your water, that's still a reliable way to kill bacteria and viruses.
Can't argue with boiling?
The key is really to understand the limitation of your current filtration system and take those extra steps if you need to, to make sure your water is as safe as possible.
Got it. So we've got chlorine and pesticides, lead and copper, hard water, nitrates, tiny little bacteria. What else are we missing?
Oh, well, how about heavy metals? Like arsenic and mercury, those are nasty.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about those. Scary stuff.
They are. They can build up in your body over time and potentially cause some serious health problems.
And standard filters don't always catch them.
Not reliably, no. And then there's the big one, the one everyone's talking about these days. PFAS.
Oh, yeah, the forever chemicals. I've heard that term thrown around, but honestly, I'm not really sure what makes them so bad.
Well, PFAS is a whole group of man-made chemicals, and they're incredibly persistent. Like, they stick around in the environment and in our bodies for a really long time. That's why they call them forever chemicals.
And they get into our water.
They do. They're found in so many products, nonstick cookware, firefighting foam, you name it, and they can leach into the water supply.
So how do they end up in our water? Like, is it from factories and stuff?
It can be from manufacturing and industrial use, yes. Also, landfills where products containing PFAS break down, and even just everyday use of products with PFAS, they can get into wastewater systems and eventually back into the environment and the water cycle. It's a big web.
So even with a filter, we could be drinking these forever chemicals.
It's a concern. Most standard filters don't do a great job of removing them.
So are we doomed?
No, not doomed. There are specialized filters that use things like granular activated carbon or reverse osmosis. Those can help, but even those might not catch every single type of PFAS. It's a tough one. A lot of ongoing research is happening to find better ways to remove them.
Science to the rescue, hopefully.
Fingers crossed. But the bottom line is, knowing what your filter doesn't remove is just as important as knowing what it does. It helps you make informed choices about your water.
Right. Speaking of things slipping through, what about microplastics? Are those little bits of plastic something filters can handle?
That's a question I get a lot, actually, and there's some good news on that front. The article mentioned a study from just last year, 2023, that showed some types of those pitcher filter, none of the common ones, they were able to remove over 75% of common microplastic fragments.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's encouraging. Not a perfect solution, obviously, but it's a step in the right direction.
So where does all this leave us? It sounds like choosing the right filter can be kind of a minefield.
It can be. It really depends on your individual needs and concerns. Like, do you have hard water? Are nitrates an issue where you live? Are you worried about microplastics or PFAS? Once you have a better understanding of what might be in your water, you can pick a filter that's designed to deal with those specific things.
Makes sense. I have to admit, I was feeling kind of overwhelmed at first. I was like, how am I supposed to know what's in my water?
I hear you. It can be a lot to take in. But a good place to start is by contacting your local water supplier. They usually have reports on water quality in your area. You can also get your water tested if you want a really detailed analysis. And of course, there's a ton of information online. Just be sure to stick to reliable sources.
Okay, that's good advice. Honestly, this whole conversation has made me think a lot more about the water I'm drinking. I kind of just took it for granted before,
It's easy to do, but like you said at the beginning, clean water is something we rely on every day, and it's worth taking the time to understand how we can make sure the water we're drinking is as safe and healthy as possible.
Absolutely. And maybe this deep dive will get some folks thinking about other things they can do beyond filtration to ensure their water is top-notch.
I hope so. There's always more we can learn and do.
That's the truth. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap things up for today, but before we go, I want to leave you with a little something to ponder. Knowing what you know now about what's lurking in our water, what extra steps are you going to take to ensure yours is as pure as can be? Think about it.
It's food for thought, for sure.
All right, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time.
Take care.